I am very pleased to announce that my book, Morbid Reflections, is available for purchase in audio form. I wrote this book just after I took what I knew was going to be my very last full-time professorship. I had just left a long-term position as a professor where it had become clear to me how much the American educational system had collapsed. At this point in time, it was becoming clear to me that there was very little demand for pure analytic philosophy. I realized that there were more pressing issues relating to society and also to psychopathology that had to be described. It was also very clear to me at this point that the work, for lack of a better word, done by professional so-called philosophers consisted of sterile and irrelevant exercises which, in addition to being both remedial in nature and of little inherent significance, were being done badly, even relative to their own blinkered terms, by those same contemporary so-called philosophers. At this point in my life, I had acquired the experience necessary to see the world as it is, and I had developed the intellectual instruments necessary to process all of this experience. Morbid Reflections was initially written as a private idea diary. It was my first serious attempt to do work that was fundamentally psychoanalytic and sociological as opposed to narrowly philosophical in nature. Before writing Morbid Reflections, I wrote a large-scale treatise on the philosophical underpinnings of psychoanalysis. This treatise, titled Empiricism and the Foundations of Psychology, is my most substantial work to date. Despite being heavily informed by psychoanalytic thought and by a knowledge and careful study of psychopathology, Empiricism and the Foundations of Psychology is fundamentally philosophical in orientation. By contrast, Morbid Reflections, though of very modest proportions compared to Empiricism and the Foundations of Psychology, is in its way a serious work, and, more importantly, while being a serious work, it is an approachable work, one that speaks to all reflective people, not just to those with training in academic philosophy. And for that reason, this work represents a significant development in my own thought. Also, it is an honest work, if nothing else, and it is informed by years of experience that was experienced honestly and reflectively. At the same time, while being intelligible to all educated and thoughtful persons, it is informed not just by experience, but also by careful study of the relevant issues. Morbid Reflections is divided into several chapters, namely, is mental illness about having false beliefs? Means versus ends. Money as an end unto itself. Masks. Revenge. Categories as mental constructs. Approval versus recognition. Bureaucrats versus pedants. Addicts versus degenerates. What does it take to be free? Bureaucratic inertia. The bureaucrat as pseudo-person. Marriage as an externalization of internal compulsion. Addiction. Traditional values as counter-sociopathogens. Psychological adulthood. Acceptance versus belief. Emotion as belief. Sellouts. Two kinds of psychosis. Could an omniscient being do anything? Department politics. Two kinds of heroin addicts. And finally, aphorisms. Please enjoy the following promotional excerpt from the audiobook itself. This excerpt is taken from the very last chapter of the work, the chapter titled Aphorisms. And the audiobook itself is narrated by Mitchell K. Johnson and available for purchase at audible.com. Please enjoy.
Aphorisms. A man's identity is defined by his relationship to fear. Can he tolerate it? A woman's identity is defined by her relationship to love. Does she have it? Man of action is a pleonasm. One of the driving forces of history is the fact that people have no way of discharging rage, except in ways that require them to turn their backs on their values and therefore to despise themselves. False accusation equals true confession. False accusations invariably projective, oftentimes multiply so. I don't respect you equals you don't respect me and I don't respect myself. You don't understand people equals I don't understand people and you do understand me, and therefore know that I don't understand people. There are three ways to have power: be at the top of an institution, be outside an institution, and not be at the top of an institution, but abuse the lack of power at your disposal. Be a bureaucrat, in other words. Bureaucrats don't make history. Bureaucrats are weak people. But there is a difference between being a bureaucrat and being a weak person. In fact, strictly speaking, bureaucrats aren't weak people. They're too weak to be weak. A weak person is somebody who has values, not politically mandated analogs thereof, and who knowingly violates them. A bureaucrat is somebody for whom that ship has sailed, as it were. The bureaucrat has no values. He isn't weak, because to be weak is to be incapable of defeating the opposition, and the bureaucrat, by definition, has no opposition. He is the ultimate minus man. Anyone who falsely accuses someone is himself guilty of the offense in question. Anyone who falsely characterizes someone himself has the characteristic in question. We revile prostitutes because they do overtly what we do covertly. We sell our souls. They sell their bodies. What they do is perceptible. What we do isn't. But what they do is otherwise comparable to what we do, except that it involves a much more profound forfeiture of identity, and we therefore scapegoat them. Any law that prohibits the commission of a victimless act is a displacement. Somebody is being strawmanned. Somebody is being punished, or made eligible for punishment, for observably doing, to no one's detriment, what others are doing unobservably to everyone's detriment. Two types of superego. 1. The first kind requires the subject to get the emotional approval of others. 2. The second requires the subject to comply with depersonalized, abstract standards of right and wrong. Sociopathization, self-alienation, occurs when these two superegos come into conflict, and when, in addition, the subject chooses to comply with first kind of superego. Heroization, the opposition of sociopathization, occurs when the subject makes the opposite choice. Two cognitive maps, one subjective, the other objective. Mind internal information flows inefficiently because of this divide. Emotions as links between the two spheres of ideation. Repression made possible by the aforementioned inefficiencies. Two kinds of psychopathology: those that corrupt the ideation preceding decision formation, and those that corrupt decision formation itself. The relationship between insanity on the one hand and criminal liability on the other is to be understood in terms of this distinction. People become drug addicts to externalize the otherwise internal compulsions that determine their thought and behavior. It's easier to believe that one is a non-robot whose thought and behavior would be free if they weren't driven by drug addiction than it is to believe that one is a robot whose thought and behavior are driven by compulsive forces that constitute one's very being.